actually going to start off, I think I'm going to start off with some Rainbot. Make sure. Oh, should I do everything now? No, I think it's good. We can make that bigger. So start off with that. Sorry. Messaging somebody on Discord. And we'll start.
Sponsored by Raycon. Is the world opening back up or closing down again? At this point, no one knows, but either way, be it inside or outside, Raycon's everyday earbuds have you covered. These earbuds, first and foremost, are comfortable and don't constantly feel like they're going to fall out.
Shout out Raycon.
You can grab your own pair today for 15% off and use them for more productive things like audiobooks, meditations, working out, and so on by heading on over to buyraycon.com/rainbot. Again, that's buyraycon.com/rainbot.
Hey, if you're just joining us, it's now 5 o'clock. This is News 4 at 5. This story's been developing since about 3 o'clock. This is file tape of a man who's got into a bulldozer that he's made into a makeshift armored-covered bulldozer, and he's damaged or destroyed half a dozen buildings in Granby, a town of about 1,500, about 50 miles west of Denver in Grand County. So far, we're hearing no one's been injured, but that has not been confirmed.
On June 4th of 2004, a 52-year-old man by the name of Marvin Heemeyer mailed several audio tapes to his brother. Following this, he returned to his muffler shop, gathered weapons, various supplies, and a list of targets, before climbing into a bulldozer that he'd modified into a tank, sporting a 30-ton armored shell. The Killdozer, as it's now popularly known as, was complete and ready to wreak havoc on the town of Granby, Colorado. At approximately 3 p.m., Heemeyer crashed through the walls of his own business and struck his first target, the Mountain Park concrete plant that was located just across the street. To Heemeyer, the plant was a symbol of the problems he felt had pushed him to plan his rampage, the details of which were documented in the hours of tape he'd recorded throughout the Killdozer's construction. See, the concrete plant had damaged his business, and when he'd purchased the bulldozer with the intention of building a road to bring in new customers, permission to do so had been denied. The town council was vowing to make money at the expense of everyone else, and Heemeyer was not the only one in Granby, Colorado. At approximately 3 p.m., Heemeyer crashed through the walls of his own business and struck his first target, the Mountain Park concrete plant that was located just across the street. To Heemeyer, the plant was a symbol of the problems he felt had pushed him to plan his rampage, the details of which were documented in the hours of tape he'd recorded throughout the Killdozer's construction. See, the concrete plant had damaged his business, and when he'd purchased the bulldozer with the intention of building a road to bring in new customers, permission to do so had been denied. The town council was vowing to big money at the expense of everyone else, and Heemeyer was not the only one in Granby who thought so. Heemeyer, as it turns out, tried to take things into his own hands. Acting quickly, the concrete plant's owner attempted to stop the Killdozer with a front-end loader before allegedly being shot at and forced to flee. Minutes later, Heemeyer had already destroyed 2 buildings and several vehicles, but he was not done yet. He then made his way to the highway, at this point being pursued by several emergency response vehicles, one of which being a police SUV that got crushed by the DIY tank. Before the Killdozer could reach town, Undersheriff Glenn Traynor managed to climb on top of it and open fire. But it goes without saying that this was nowhere near enough to stop Heemeyer's destruction.
Damn.
The effort to stop the Killdozer continued, and just about every method of doing so you could think of was attempted and failed. Bullets, explosives, an industrial scraper, none of these were effective, and so Heemeyer pushed on. Keep in mind that while Heemeyer had his list of targets, no one had any idea who or what he was aiming for, so as a precautionary measure, a public alert was sent out via reverse 911. By then, Heemeyer had turned his sights on Town Hall, the very place which had been instrumental in putting him on the losing end of the zoning disputes. Next, he targeted a local newspaper office, one that, in his eyes, did little to bring his complaints the attention.
So this guy was just mega petty and bought a bulldozer. And then anybody who didn't fully get down with him or grasp what he was trying to do, he just destroyed their businesses and may or may not have attempted to kill him. So he's popping off. Some people, man.
They deserved. He'd also bring down the home of a former judge. The judge himself had died years prior, but had ruled against him in the past, so to him, the house in which his widow lived had to go. All in all, the event would last just over 2 hours, severely damage or destroy a total of 13 buildings, and cause around $7 million worth of damage in total. As it turns out, the destruction would only come to an end when Heemeyer ripped through one Gamble's hardware store and fell through into its basement. There, the killdozer became trapped as damage sustained over the course of the rampage, and the massive amount of added weight from its armored shell had finally overwhelmed it. Marvin Heemeyer was the only person to die that day, having taken his own life when the bulldozer became trapped. Attempts to breach it with explosives failed, and so it took a further 12 hours of work with a torch for law enforcement to get inside and recover his body. Given the monumental task that was getting in, it's safe to say that the perpetrator likely had no intention of ever getting out. Heemeyer's actions left a major impact, not just on Granby, Colorado, but also in the general public consciousness. Heemeyer is often considered a folk hero to some for what they see as his taking extreme measures to stand up to an abuse of power. Perhaps his most infamous quote is, "Sometimes reasonable men just do unreasonable things." This in particular resonates with people, which makes sense given how powerless we can feel in the face of uncaring governments and
I felt that.
odds.
That's crazy.
Now, just how reasonable Heemeyer was, however, is up for debate. His supporters will tout the fact that no one else was killed as evidence of his intentions, though some feel the lack of death was not for lack of trying. It's claimed that Heemeyer shot at gas tanks, which some took as intent to kill nearby officers, though supporters feel it was only intended to further damage property. Others cite the fact that 11 of the 13 buildings he targeted were occupied. Keep in mind, this was all midday and during business hours. A notable example includes a library that was attached to Town Hall, in which school children were present until just before the attack. There was, of course, no way for Heemeyer to know that the building had been emptied, and while we can't prove that he specifically wanted to kill people, if he was truly only interested in destroying property, you'd think he would have done this at 3 a.m. instead of 3 p.m. But of course, there's no way to read his mind.
We'd like to talk now with Bonnie Brown. Bonnie is joining us by telephone. And Bonnie, we understand that you are a friend, perhaps, of the man who is inside that bulldozer. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What can you tell us about this person?
Well, he systematically is going through the different buildings. That is correct, the information about the ongoing dispute with the concrete company. And he went to Gamble's because the person who owns it was on the town council. It had to do with excessive taxes on his property that he purchased to build his muffler shop. And he talked with me about doing this back in January, and just in a conversation when we were having dinner.
I don't know why I'm dropping
and
frames.
of course, I thought that he was just kidding. I had no idea that he would follow through with it and continue.
Bonnie, without giving us his name, and please don't, tell us, when you did talk to him, and he was planning this, according to you, did he mention the buildings he was going to hit, the specific buildings?
No, he just said that the people
Now
that,
I want to test it, see if it drops frames, if it's in low.
He was going to, I'm trying to think of how he put it, that he would pay them back
Bonnie,
for what they had done to him.
take us again through his gripe. I don't quite understand what he was upset about.
Well, you know, I wasn't really paying attention because I thought that he was just kidding, and he had mentioned something about that he purchased this land to build his muffler store at a public land auction.
I think it helps a little
and
bit,
that,
but
unbeknownst to him, the man who had
yeah, it
owned the
looks like it's
property
helping.
and that was losing it was bidding against him, and he wasn't able to exceed the bid that this person had bid on, so he ended up winning the property. And the man actually had annexed this piece of property under the table with the town of Granby.
Yeah, so he's just being
and
mega petty.
that Marv didn't know anything about this, and so he tried to sell the previous owners, the land back, and he didn't have enough money.
The year of the attack had also seen Heemeyer's father pass away, and his
Yeah,
romantic
he is
relationship fell
probably,
apart.
yeah.
This, in combination with his zoning grievances, which dated back as early as 1992, may go some way to explaining his state of mind. Heemeyer, as it seems, had begun to believe he was enacting God's will, and even took the fact that no customers questioned the makeshift tank
Katie,
he was
can you
working
hear
on as a
Rainbot, or
sign
can
he
you
was
just
being
hear me?
protected by a divine force. Among the material he left behind,
can
he said the following, quote,
Discord me
God
or
bless
put it
me
in
in advance
chat.
for the task I'm about to undertake. It is my duty. God has asked me to do this. It's a cross that I'm going to carry, and I'm going to carry it in God's name. So, whether or not you think Marvin Heemeyer is a hero or a villain, it seems the authorities were able to predict his infamy. The remains of the killdozer were broken down and carted off to several undisclosed scrapyards in an effort to avoid would-be collectors seeking out mementos of his rampage.
It's always crazy people.
This video was researched and written by Lux Noctis and edited by Darkfire Productions, with additional writing and editing by yours truly. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the
Can I
next
not
one.
click? What the heck? YouTube, what are you doing? What's going on here? Okay, now let me free. Okay, there we go. That was weird. That was really weird. And the chapter always slaps. One day ago.
Hey you, and welcome. My name is Mike,
I kinda
and in
wanna
this old
snack.
video we're going all the way to a place called, you may have heard of it, Yosemite. Honestly, it looks like one of the most beautiful places in the world. Definitely in my top 3 places to visit
Top
someday.
tree.
Though, you know, probably
11, make a
probably
wish.
wouldn't have
Just
wanted to do it, around the time
My
I'll be talking
desktop
about. So,
time
this is one
way
of the
up.
more fascinating stories about one of the more, I think, fascinating characters in that the seeds for what happened, they were sown 25 years before. It's also a messed up one, once again, so look forward to that. Let's give it a go. Visiting Yosemite in February during the winter season, it's one of the best times to visit there if you want almost the whole place by your lonesome. It is the quietest time of the year for visitors. Some roads are closed due to the snowfall, and tire chains are a necessity for sure. Temperatures range from -6 degrees to 10 degrees, and you can go skiing, snowboarding, hiking, all that jazz. In the February of 1999, 3 women decided to pop over and visit it during that quiet time of the year. Traveling all the way from Eureka, California, which is, it's like an 8-hour drive. I mean, they flew, because F that. Was 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and Julie's friend, 16-year-old Silvina Peloso, who was all the way from Argentina, spending a couple of months in the States. This would be a nice, maybe quiet, probably quiet, vacation for the 3 of them. Scratch quiet. They flew into San Francisco Airport on the 12th of February 1999. rented a car, spent a few days driving, stopping off at a few bits and bobs before arriving at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal, probably the last town you'll go through before you're in the national park proper. They arrived there early on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, got ready to settle in for a bit, would maybe go for a little bit of a hike, and then within 48 hours they would vanish. The morning after they arrived, the 15th, they headed off for a little bit of a hike, coming back to the lodge that evening. The next morning, the 16th, staff popped the head in to do some cleaning. They weren't there, and the room didn't look suspicious or odd, so they went about their business. And they were gone. They were due to check out of the hotel right that day, the 16th. They were supposed to drive all the way back to San Francisco and meet Carol's husband Jens there at the airport, and from there, they would fly to Arizona, and, you know, a bit more of a vacay baby. Jens never saw them.
Okay, cool.
There were no shows. He couldn't call them. He couldn't contact them.
You can hear my boy talking. Cool.
You know the drill. He then called the cops, and the search, beginning at the Cedar Lodge Motel in El Portal and spreading out across the Sierra Nevadas from there, extensive as shit, I believe the official term is. They spoke with all employees at the lodge. They thoroughly searched the room, and they didn't believe they had been kidnapped. Their initial thought was that they may have gone hiking, and at that time of the year, some of the trails, well, many trails, they can be treacherous, so maybe an accident or whatever. As the days went by, a couple of witnesses would come forward saying they'd seen the three girls around the parking lot asking for directions, and the car Carol rented, it was a red sports car, that would also be spotted a few times over the next couple of days. People were like kicking the tires. You know, what happened? Where did they go? People were scratching their heads, and there's a lot of wilderness out there. As I said, there was no ransom or any indication of kidnapping, but, you know, foul play wasn't ruled out entirely, as Carol's wallet, that was discovered not long after they disappeared. But it was found on the streets in Modesto, in the complete opposite direction of Yosemite. How it ended up there was a mystery at the time. As the weeks went by, them you know, having befallen some kind of accidents, that looked more,
not gonna be a mystery for
you know,
very long.
It was more like, well, you know, the other thing. That seemed more and more likely.
Somebody has had to see some of this, something that's gone on. They can't just disappear.
This is my firstborn, my wife. I've been married for 21 years, and, you know, it's, just imagine what it's like. It's terrible.
What keeps you going through all of
Love, I guess.
Ever since their daughter, granddaughter, and family friend disappeared right after Valentine's Day, Francis and Carol Carrington have learned to wait.
They're beautiful girls that were just on the verge of growing up.
Days stretched into weeks. The families kept a hopeful vigil. Sabina's parents flew in from Argentina.
She wouldn't hurt anything or anybody, not even with words.
Weeks would go by as the Sierra Nevadas were searched. Weeks, that is, until the 18th of March arrived. That day, in a remote area of the Stanislaus Forest, a couple of hours from the Yosemite National Park, Carol's rented car was found. And it was found burnt to shite. In the boot was Carol and Sylvina. They were, due to the fire, unrecognizable.
As a father, I feel terrible. I'm supposed to die. Excuse me.
That's sad. That's really sad.
No sign of Julie Sund. Well, I mean, no sign for exactly 1 week, because on the 25th of March, a couple of miles away, she was found. And she had been discovered due to an anonymous tip. Somebody, wink wink, had sent in a map. Well, a drawing of a map, rather, with her location on it. And it said, on top, "We had fun with this one." She was badly decomposing, but it was determined that her throat had been slit. Pretty, grisly. don't you think? The investigation would be equally as big as the search, as they now knew they had a cold-blooded killer walking the woods. A task force was then set up to comb through the area. I mean, pretty much they knew right away that this fella was a local. He knew the area very well, at least, so anyone who was a bit shady and local, round them up, boys. Sex offenders, drug users, anyone with a hint of violence in their record was brought in and questioned about the case. And by mid-April, ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Without naming names, they believed that the killer was already arrested, and he was already behind bars on unrelated charges. We arrested him before we even knew it was him. We deserve a pat on the back for that one. Eventually, 11 names would be leaked to the press. These were all people who were questioned and put behind bars for one reason or another. And the authorities were like, you know, we're not entirely sure which one it is, but it's one of them. It's gotta be one of them. Come on, you know? It's one of them. Judging by their history, they could have done it. They more than likely did it. So they did it. This case solved itself. Come on. Our job is done here. It's tourist season, you know? Open the beaches.
I'm pleased and happy to repeat the news that we have in fact caught and killed a large predator.
Case closed.
I can't do that either.
For about 20 days. Because then the killer struck again.
I think I can't do that. So
On the 22nd of July, 1999, a woman's body was found.
Whoa.
Her head wasn't. At least not for a bit. See, someone had called into the park rangers that their friend, 26-year-old Joey Armstrong, was missing. Joey worked for the park. She was a naturalist. And when they arrived at her cabin, there was no sign of her. But they did find what looked like the aftermath of a struggle. And half a mile into the woods, her body was discovered. Her head was in the stream a few feet away.
Damn.
She had been due to drive up, you know, and spend some time with a friend, and her car was still out front in her cabin, and it was all packed up, like she was ready to go. Until it seemed like someone came across her. Now people, you know, who'd just been kind of getting over that triple homicide a couple of months back, and the police had told them, hey, you're safe, you're always safe with us, you know? Now they were shitting bricks. This time the investigation would be a little bit swifter. And it would be right. The authorities started looking for witnesses, anyone who had been in the area around the time of the 21st/22nd of July. One vehicle was seen in the area, so the police started looking for it, and it was owned by a fella named Carrie Stainer. Carrie was a local, and he in fact worked at, guess where, the Cedar Lodge in El Portal. He was a handyman there. He'd whatever bits and bobs he needed to do, and he would be doing. He'd been questioned about the 3 murders back in February. Questioned like hundreds of others were at the time, and, well, the police didn't question him too hard. He was soon released. So, his vehicle had been spotted in the area near Joey's campsite, and the police, well, they just thought he'd be a regular old witness to interview. They started yapping away to him, searched his truck, took his backpack, and told him not to leave the area. You know, might have a few more bits and bobs for you to answer, so don't go anywhere. He went somewhere. He booked off like immediately and took his mustache with him. On the 24th of July, a manager at the Laguna del Sol nudist colony called the police after seeing Carrie in the news and said, well, he's here, he's hanging out with his wang out, so come and get him. From there he was taken to Sacramento and intensively questioned. And he said what happened.
Yosemite murders. Tonight, FBI investigators are asking themselves whether they could have prevented the murder of a young naturalist in the national park. The man they have arrested was questioned once before. Investigators interviewed him earlier this year in connection with 3 other murders. Back then, they released him. Tonight, they're wondering why.
FBI officials made the announcement this afternoon that they now believe the murders of 3 missing sightseers at Yosemite National Park are linked to the recent killing of 26-year-old Joey Armstrong, a Yosemite wildlife guide.
We now believe there is a connection between Armstrong's murder and the murders of Carol's son, her daughter, Julie's son, and their family friend, Silvina Peloso.
Authorities say their suspect is 37-year-old Carrie Stainer, a handyman at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite, the last place the tourists were seen alive. Though police won't disclose how Stainer became a suspect in both murder cases, they say they have found considerable evidence in the last 72 hours, since discovering Armstrong's decapitated body last Thursday in the park near her home.
Aww. Is she a redhead?
He said he wanted a movie made about him, just like there had been his brother. Who's his brother? Who is his brother? And, more importantly, who was Cary Stainer? Cary was born on the 13th of August, 1961, growing up in the farming town of Merced, California, the gateway to Yosemite, about 2 hours from it. He grew up with his younger brother Stephen, 3 sisters, and mom and dad, Kay and Delbert. I guess you could say shit really hit the fan. And that's putting it lightly, when a fella named Kenneth Parnell, who worked at Yosemite, he was driving through the town of Merced on the 4th of December, 1972.
4th of December,
Kenneth
1972.
was a child molester.
Was probably
I mean, of course
after.
he was. Look at him. That mug is a dead giveaway. And that evening in December 1972, he saw a 7-year-old Stephen Stainer walking home from school. Stephen was lured into the car and abducted.
So this is what
Kay and
happened to
Delbert
the
alerted
guy.
the police that their youngest boy was missing. A massive search began,
So in the
but
70s,
nothing
I think.
was found. And for the next over 7 years, Stephen would be held captive by Kenneth. I mean, we're talking about murders and beheadings, but Jesus, I think this is the darkest part of the story. In the meantime, Cary, 4 years older than his younger brother Stephen, he was a nice guy. Until his brother was taken, apparently. He became a wreck. He always wore a hat because he compulsively tore his
that's
hair
what
out.
happened to his
He started
brother.
doing weird shit, like exposing himself to others. He was developing into a creep, and in his noggin things started getting darker and darker. Then, Stephen not only rescued himself, he also rescued another victim of Kenneth's. Stephen was taken when he was 7, abused and held captive, hidden in plain sight, going by the name given to him, Dennis. But as the years went on, well, Kenneth, Kenneth, maybe Stephen, who was 14 years old now, held captive for 7 years, he was getting too old for him. He was aging out for, the pedo. In 1980, he took another boy, this time 5-year-old Timothy White, from the town of Ukiah, about a 4-hour drive from Merced. For about 2 weeks, Stephen had watched Timothy go through what he himself had gone through, and he just couldn't. On the 1st of March 1980, when Kenneth was at work, Stephen took Timothy and they fled, hitchhiking back to Ukiah. Eventually, they went to a police station, and Stephen was back. The Stainer family, which was torn apart for over 7 years, well, things started getting better.
Apparently, Stephen had been kidnapped and told that he had been adopted. Stephen had been calling his abductor Dad for some time. For 7 years, his parents, Kay and Delbert Stainer, never gave up hope that he was alive.
Everyone was happy. Absolutely everybody. Except, maybe Cary. See, well, as I said, there was some weird shit going on in Cary's head. One being, since his brother was taken, he felt neglected. He felt like he didn't exist. Like Stephen was their parents' favorite son. And then, when Stephen came back, he resented all the attention his brother was getting. There would be movies and books about Stephen's story.
I know my first name is Steve.
And, well, in the future, Cary's story too. Kenneth was arrested, and he was convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment. Not, sexual abuse, and he would be sentenced to 7 whole years and serve 5 whole years. Yes, he served less time in prison than Stephen did being abducted. That's fucked up. Kenneth would later be imprisoned again for trying to buy a child. Wow! Shocking. He would eventually die in prison in 2008. The old, see you next Tuesday. Cary, as I said, kind of resenting everybody, especially his brother, who was, viewed as a hero. Well, he would take refuge in Yosemite. He would go over there all the time, amongst nature, the birds, the bees, the bears, and Bigfoot, actually. He was a big Bigfoot head, this guy. He was obsessed with the oak, even saying he saw it once. Ooh. Stephen would later marry and have 2 kids, but tragically, for a man whose life was already tragic, he would be killed at age 24 in 1989 in a motorcycle accident. A year later, Cary's uncle Jesse, who he was living with at the time, would be shot and killed in their home. the police never found the killer. Carrie's friends would recognize he had rage issues, nervous breakdowns, and, well, not good impulses. In school, he was voted most creative, was doodling constantly. Everyone thought, he'd be a cartoonist or a graphic designer. Instead, he bounced from one job to another. Eventually, he landed a job as maintenance man at Cedar Lodge during the summer of 1997. He worked, as I said, maintenance man, local handyman, doing whatever needed to be doing, and then when he was on his days off, he'd go down to the local nudist colony and sizzle the sausage. Then, at age 37, he murdered Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. He'd been planning it for over a year to rape and murder, and he targeted other women too. These were just the ones he was successful with. He was actually even planning on doing it with his own girlfriend and her daughters before he chickened out.
Sacramento today, a motel handyman has confessed to killing a woman in Yosemite National Park. He's also the prime suspect in the murder of 3 sightseers near Yosemite in February.
And so, on the night of the 15th of February, he knocked on the door of Carol and the girls' room with some bullshit excuse that he had to go in. This picture was taken about 20 minutes before. After speaking to him through the window, Carol refused to let him in until he said, he'd have to go and get the manager, and she was like, alright, fine. So he walked into their bathroom, pretended to fix the fan, while, the 2 girls watched Jerry Maguire and Carol read a book. After a few minutes, he came out of the bathroom with a shooter. He came out and bound them. He strangled Carol first, and then stuffed her in the boot of her rented car. Then he went back to the teens, tore their clothes off, strangled Silvina, and sexually assaulted Julie. He then tied Julie up on the bed, dumped Silvina in the boot with Carol, and cleaned up the room. He then wrapped up Julie, and they drove. He drove to where Julie would eventually be found, sexually assaulted her again, told her he loved her, and then cut her throat at dawn. He then drove the car to where it would be found, and lit it up. Carol's wallet, that was found in Modesto because he dumped it there. He was trying to throw them off the trail, essentially. And, obviously he was the one who anonymously sent in that map saying where Julie's body, was. Back in February, he was questioned about it by the police. Questioned like everybody else, and they didn't question him too hard. Everybody said he wasn't the type. He wasn't a troublemaker. He was a real nice guy. Super cool dude. Aren't they always?
For the past 2 years, Kerry Stainer rented a room above the Cedar Lodge restaurant. He worked next door at the motel as a handyman, and it was at Cedar Lodge that local teens got to know him.
We were sitting there swimming. He walked in to do his job around the pool, do some handyman work, and Aaron hollered at him, told him to come over and meet us, and every day after that, pretty much that we were over there, we'd see him and talk to him for about 5 minutes.
Parker Bevington and Aaron Ludwig both work at the Chevron just down the road from Cedar Lodge. Both young men are stunned. The man they were friendly with has apparently confessed to last week's killing. They insist he couldn't have seemed more normal.
As for Joey, he didn't plan it. He kind of just stumbled across her. She was heading in and out of her cabin, packing up her car, packing up all her shit. And after, watching her for a while, he was like, oh shit, she's alone. He then started talking to her, pulled out his handgun, and forced her into the cabin, where he duct taped her up.
Pulled out the gun and put it to her head. She turned around and freaked out. I told her to go inside.
He then put her in his car and started driving, but at one point she managed to dive headfirst out of the car window and booked it.
I was driving. She started going crazy, just jumping all over the place in the back of the truck. I couldn't really control her. And she fell off through the window. But really right in front of the barn. I slammed the truck in the park and jumped out. And she got up off the ground and started like, took the knife in my back pocket and I slit her throat.
He chased her down and cut her throat. He then took her further into the woods and cut her head off.
People are sick.
This time there was a lot more evidence than there was for the first murders. And he was very upset when the police were questioning him about, about being in the area of Joey's murder. When they took his backpack, he was very upset about that because in the backpack was what we would call A murder kit. You got a rope, you got duct tape, you got a knife.
No, that's not necessary.
Carey would confess, but not plead guilty to the murders. Not guilty, he would say, by reason of insanity, his attorneys citing his history of mental illness. He had been heavily involved with drugs at one point, and he had attempted suicide back in 1991. Also, at one point during his confession to having done everything, by the way, they would have gotten him without the confession because of all the evidence he left at Joey's murder. But I digress, because he said he would tell them everything if they gave him child porn. Did he really think they would do that? He was found sane and convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder by a jury in 2001. In 2002, he was sentenced to death, where Carey Stainer still remains to this day. Carey Stainer would say that he dreamed of killing people, killing women, ever since he was a boy. When he was 7 years old, he started fantasizing about murder, which is interesting because a lot of people have said it was the trauma of his brother's kidnapping that really kind of set him off. He felt guilty that his brother was taken. Well, it seems like before his brother was taken, he was, probably would have just ended up that way anyway. And as usual, you would think that being the victim, of a tragedy might give you some empathy, but, nope. Maybe sometimes it just gives you more pain you want to pass on to others, because that's what he fucking did. It's a circle. It's like the circle of life. Just good luck trying to Disneyfy that one. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with this old guy. Here going, I'll see you as always real soon in the next L1. Till then, please look after yourselves. Take care. Mike out.
I love this man's voice.
Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. With most of us spending multiple hours each day online, it's safe to say the internet knows a lot about us. Unfortunately these days, there are plenty of people out there trying to get their hands on that data of yours. NordVPN's double data encryption helps you stay hidden online and gives you increased digital anonymity. If you've never used a VPN before because you're worried it all sounds too technical, worry no more. NordVPN is extremely easy to use. You can connect with just a single click, and hey presto, you're connected. Keep your personal information safe with NordVPN on up to 6 devices per account. Even better, their VPN is super fast and reliable, with over 5,400 servers across 59 countries. That not only means you can connect to a server near you for increased speed, you can also connect to servers in far-off countries. Why might you do that? Well, when you log into a streaming service in your home country, many of your favorite shows and movies are region-locked. With NordVPN, you can access the content that isn't available where you live. Right now, I'm living in Japan, but I can just open up the NordVPN map, click on the UK. This is 21-year-old University of Virginia student, Otto Warmbier. In early 2016, Otto was scheduled to visit Hong Kong as a part of a UVA study abroad program. But Otto had his heart set on visiting a very different Asian country whilst en route. He contacted Young Pioneer Tours, a Chinese-based adventure tour company, who promised destinations your mother would rather you stayed away from.
Oh, yeah.
Such places included the irradiated ruins of Pripyat, the wild, rocky frontiers of Afghanistan, and also Otto's desired travel destination, the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea. Otto arrived in North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, on the 29th of December 2015. His tour group included 10 other American citizens, as well as a Liverpudlian named Danny Grattan. Danny remembers that the tour group were a like-minded band of mostly young people, and despite the risky location, there was an overwhelming atmosphere of fun and excitement. Naturally, all tour groups that enter Pyongyang are strictly controlled by the North Korean government, but during the New Year tours, the Kim regime tries to show its guests that it parties just as heartily as the next country, and plies the tourists with vast amounts of booze. Danny Grattan remembers the group drank very heavily in Pyongyang's one and only hotel for foreign guests. However, there is one floor of the Yanggakdo International Hotel that is forbidden to foreigners. The so-called secret fifth floor that houses the hotel's star. The fifth floor is devoid of any kind of luxury, with bare floors and grey-painted walls. The only colour comes from propaganda posters that line the walls. Foreign knowledge of the floor's existence has given rise to a kind of fifth floor challenge, daring tourists to venture into the forbidden hallways, sometimes just to peek, sometimes to take a few pictures. Those who are caught usually just receive a warning or have their cell phones seized. But at exactly 1:57 AM on New Year's Day, a man, purported to be Otto Warmbier, was caught on camera entering the forbidden floor. This figure supposedly tried to steal one of the propaganda posters, then left empty-handed. Just over 24 hours later, Otto and the rest of the tour group were sitting in the departure lounge of Pyongyang Airport, awaiting their flight back to Beijing. Danny Grattan remembers swapping contact details with Otto, only to see a gang of North Korean officials approaching with a look of urgency about them. Otto Frederick Warmbier, one of them said, "Please, come with us." "Well, that's the last time we'll ever see you again," Danny half-joked. But Otto didn't look scared at all. In fact, he gave a kind of half-smile as he was led away. The group briefly awaited his return, but when their plane was ordered to take off without him, they began to fear the worst. Although North Korea admitted to detaining Otto, it took them 6 weeks to announce their reasons for doing so. That reason being subversion. According to the group that Otto was with, he wasn't even in the hotel that night, and the person in the CCTV footage didn't even resemble him. Still, the North Koreans went ahead with the trial. The picture you're looking at is of Otto's first public appearance since his arrest, one in which he begged Kim Jong-un's forgiveness. It was a complete show trial. Otto gave a coached confession, admitting to trying to take the poster, pretty much just reading from a script. If he played along, he was told, he'd be let go with a warning. At this point, though, it does appear that he broke character, genuinely pleading for his life. It was widely believed that the US State Department would secure Otto's release before sentencing. However, the North Koreans shocked the world by condemning him to 15 years hard labor. The US continued to demand Otto's release, and after a while, the North Koreans eventually gave in when things started getting heated. However, when Otto was delivered back to America, he was severely brain damaged and in a vegetative state.
That's sad.
Everyone was horrified. The North Koreans claimed that Otto had fallen into a coma after contracting botulism shortly after his trial, possibly as a result of eating rotten food. This is doubtful. As one doctor put it, for somebody who had supposedly been bedridden for more than a year, his body was in excellent condition. In Otto's case, there are definitely things the North Koreans aren't telling us. Having lost all hope, Cynthia and Fred Warmbier requested that Otto's feeding tube be removed. He passed away on the 19th of June, 2017. His story constitutes a terrifying cautionary tale that speaks to the mercilessness and brutality of the Kim regime. Looking at this photo of Otto begging for mercy, knowing he wasn't going to get any, it's truly haunting stuff.
This is Bart Whitaker, accompanied by his mother Patricia and his brother Kevin on the left. Bart had something of a troubled youth and was forced to drop out of high school after several incidents of criminality led to a psychiatrist diagnosing him with clinical symptoms of paranoid delusional disorder. Bart's parents simply threw money at the problem, hoping their affluence would plug the hole in their son's mental health. They bought him several luxury cars and a lakeside townhouse in Willis, Texas, paid for his tuition at Sam Houston State University, and even bought him a $4,000 Rolex, which was given to him as a graduation present. But Bart's graduation was nothing but a ruse. In fact, he had dropped out of university several months prior. He only told them he'd graduated as a way to gather his family in one place. You see, Bart had a plan, and it was one that would irreparably change his life for the worse. After the celebratory dinner, the Whitakers drove back home, with 19-year-old Kevin being the first to enter the house. He was greeted by the sight of a masked man, and at first, he simply smiled, believed it to be part of a prank organized by his brother. But it was no prank. The masked man raised a handgun and shot Kevin in the chest.
Jesus.
The gunman then turned the weapon on Patricia, putting a bullet in her before she collapsed to the floor. Kevin died within minutes of being hit, with Patricia passing away shortly after being airlifted to a hospital. Bart's father, Kent, attempted to rush the shooter, but was incapacitated after being shot in the shoulder. It was then Bart's turn to attempt to subdue the gunman. He was shot in the arm for his troubles, but this final wound was pre-planned, a way for Bart to divert suspicion away from himself, away from the fact that it was him that had paid the gunman to take out his family. It turned out that Bart had wanted his family out of the picture so he could collect on $1 million life insurance payout. He was sentenced to death by a Texan jury, but was later given clemency by the governor of Texas after a lengthy campaign for mercy led by his father, Kent. If only Bart had showed his mother and brother the same kind of mercy. His parents gave him everything he could ever want, and in return, he took the most precious thing of all from them, their very lives.
This is a picture of Santa Claus. Okay, it's not Santa. Santa may or may not be real, but Bruce MacArthur's real, and by the end of this segment, I can guarantee you'll wish he wasn't. 68-year-old Bruce MacArthur made most of his money as a landscaper, but come Christmas time, he'd don the inimitable red suit and take on the role of every child's favourite festive icon, Santa Claus. He'd set up ship in Toronto's Agincourt shopping mall, sitting hundreds of giddy kiddos on his knee while asking them what their dream Christmas gift might be. According to visiting parents, Bruce was a natural, and their kids adored him. Yet little did they know that Bruce was a monster, one capable of the most profane acts imaginable. And even worse, his landscaping business was little more than a front to cover up his crimes. Because, in reality, he wasn't transforming his adoring clients' gardens into visions of paradise.
Burying bodies.
He was turning them into cemeteries. Oh my god, this guy's... Bruce is what we might call a... meaning he was attracted to the remains of the recently and not so recently deceased. And in order to explore his morbid fascination, he targeted the poor, the vulnerable, and the lonely. Most of Bruce's victims were recent immigrants to Canada, such as Salim Essen or Sarouche Mahmoudi. Others were lovelorn, older men, such as Andrew Kinsman or Dean Lissowick. But all of them became a part of Bruce's sick fantasy once he dispatched of them. His usual method was strangulation, and once his victims had been snuffed out, he'd go about posing and photographing them, some in sickly comic poses, others in more carnal positions. One victim was posed wearing a fur coat with a cigar in his mouth. Others had their beards or heads shaved. Those who were less fortunate were subjected to even more hideous acts. When Bruce became bored with his victims, he'd dismember them, then dispose of their remains under the flower beds of his landscaping clients who often complimented Bruce on his green thumbs, unaware that their cosmos and daylilies were feeding on the bodies of his victims. Following an intensive police surveillance operation, Toronto authorities raided MacArthur's 19th floor apartment in the Leaside district, only to make a horrifying discovery. They found a young man, wearing absolutely no clothes, handcuffed to the bed, with a black bag secured over his head. He was terrified and begged the detectives to free him. They did, and promptly took Bruce into custody. At his trial, Bruce pled guilty, but showed no remorse for any of his actions. A judge handed him several life sentences, with a non-parole period of 25 years, meaning he'll likely die in prison, never to wear a Santa outfit ever again.
This is the List family of Westfield, New Jersey. On the far left is 46-year-old John, flanked by his wife and his youngest son, Frederick. The two older children are Patricia, 16, and John Jr., 15. John Sr. was a World War II veteran who had taken a job as a vice president of a bank in Jersey City. It was a well-paying job, and as a result, his wife was content. He took care of his mother in their large suburban home, and his children excelled in their school studies. But something was brewing beneath the surface, something invisible, an evil that pushed John to do something unforgivable. On the afternoon of November 9th, 1971, while his children were still at school, John List retrieved 2 loaded handguns from his study and executed both his wife and mother. When Patricia and Frederick arrived home from school, John ambushed them. He eliminated both, made himself a late lunch, then drove to his bank to close the family's bank accounts. Next stop was John Jr.'s high school. He promised his eldest son that he'd watch him play in an inter-school soccer game. The occasion meant a lot to the young midfielder, and his father's appearance spurred him in a game that saw his own Westfield High School beat the opposing team by several goals. On the drive home, John List congratulated his son, promising him a reward for his fine performance. But that reward would be nothing but a bullet. Ballistic evidence showed that John Jr. had struggled with his father, trying to prevent his execution. Needless to say, he failed. After that, John simply disappeared. John List left behind a 5-page letter on his desk in his office. Addressed to his local pastor, John had written that he saw far too much evil in the world, and they had taken the lives of his own family in order to save their souls. Amazingly, he successfully evaded capture for 18 years, until the crime was featured on Fox's America's Most Wanted in May of 1989. The List family segment featured an age-progressed clay bust sculpted by forensic artist Frank Bender, and incredibly, John was arrested just 2 weeks later in Virginia. He bore a striking resemblance to the often mocked clay bust. Less than a year later, John was convicted of 5 counts of first degree and handed a sentence of 5 consecutive life terms. I feel that, because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened, John said before being taken to prison. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer. On March the 21st, 2008, John passed away from pneumonia at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. He was 82, and died hoping that he would finally be reunited with his family in heaven.
This is Dale Cregan. By the time he was just 22, Cregan had amassed a sizable firearms collection and was making £22,000 a week selling illicit substances under the guise of owning a plastering business. But those close to him knew the truth. Dale was a dangerous man who, after having his eye carved out during a brawl in Thailand, chose to wear a black prosthetic as a way of intimidating his enemies. Cregan was also quick to pull the trigger, a policy that led to the murders of rival father and son gangsters David and Mark Short. Following those slayings, Cregan went on the run, sparking a nationwide manhunt that would only end when he handed himself over to the British authorities. But before he surrendered, Cregan would kill again, horrifying an entire nation and sparking a period of national mourning. At 10:30 a.m. on the 18th of September 2012, police constables Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone responded to a call in the small village of Mottram, just 12 miles east of Manchester's city centre. This followed a call from someone complaining that a man had thrown a concrete slab through the rear window of his 30 Abbey Gardens property. The caller said that the man responsible was still in the vicinity. The dispatcher assured him that officers would be there shortly. "I'll be waiting," the caller replied, before calmly hanging up. Having failed to spot any potential offenders fitting the caller's description, PCs Hughes and Bone drove into the small cul-de-sac of Abbey Gardens, hoping to question the homeowner. Yet, as they entered the small, overgrown garden at the front of the house, the door swung open, and a man appeared. It was Dale Cregan, with a pistol in one hand and a grenade in the other. There were never any broken windows or fleeing perpetrators. It was Dale himself that had called the police, and in doing so, he had led Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone right into a trap. Cregan began firing wildly at both constables as they approached. They were both protected by their body armor and made a tactical retreat, Bone rushing into cover, Hughes running back up the path. Being the only one in his sights, Cregan began unloading round after round into Hughes' back, with one bullet catching her just below the body armor, ripping right through her spine. In an instant, she was paralyzed, falling forward onto the concrete, where she was shot 3 more times. Cregan then rounded the corner and fired 23 bullets into PC Bone's direction. She tried and failed to deploy her taser, and was shot between 5 and 8 times, the fatal bullet striking where the body armor was weakest. Bone was dead, and Hughes was lying half paralyzed on the garden path. But Cregan wasn't done. Before he fled the scene, Cregan pulled the pin on the hand grenade and tossed it into the front garden. It's likely the last thing Nicola Hughes ever saw was the sight of a live grenade fizzling on the grass next to her before everything went black. Cregan gave himself over to the police the following day, stating that, "I just done 2 coppers. You were hounding my family, so I took it out on yours." In February 2013, he pled guilty to 4 counts of murder. He's one of the few British prisoners subjected to the so-called whole life order, a statute which assures he will die in prison. At their funerals, Constables Fiona Bone and Nicola Hughes were described as brave and courageous. Their chief constable added that they both exemplified the very best of British policing. Their slayings are a reminder that there is a very real and very tangible evil that exists in this world, one that can possess a man to fill his empty eye socket with a polished onyx, kill a rival's only son, then take the lives of 2 innocent police officers in one final act of despicable, unforgivable rage.
This exemplar of counterculture is Sean Flynn, and his friend on the right is named Tim Page. The only son of swashbuckling actor Errol Flynn, Sean briefly followed his father into acting before giving up the trappings of Hollywood for that of a combat photojournalist during Vietnam. Flynn was an altogether different kind of reporter, more akin to Ernest Hemingway than Walter Cronkite. He would regularly join U.S. Special Forces patrols and was present during Viet Cong ambushes. This direct approach not only resulted in Sean being wounded in combat, but he also engaged in direct combat with the Viet Cong, at one point picking up the weapon of a fallen soldier before using it to defend himself. Then, in early 1970, news broke that the North Vietnamese army had advanced into the neighboring country of Cambodia. Flynn and Page rushed to cover the story, driving their motorcycles out to the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. However, in April of that same year, Flynn and Page departed Phnom Penh, traveling back towards the Vietnamese border to attend a Saigon press conference. It's believed they came across a group of Viet Cong guerrillas who had set up an ad hoc checkpoint on Cambodia's Highway 1. Eager to interview them to get an alternative perspective on the war, Flynn and Page climbed off their bikes and followed the guerrillas into a nearby tree line. Neither were ever seen again, and the photograph you're looking at is the last ever taken of Sean Flynn and Tim Page alive. Even today, Flynn Page's fate remains a mystery, but a steady drip of information from the Vietnamese government has allowed us to paint a picture of what happened following their capture. Although they were taken alive by the Viet Cong, it's thought that Flynn and Page were soon sold on to a different group, one which made the North Vietnamese seem relatively cuddly by comparison, the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge twisted the leftist political ideas of their neighbors until they were barely recognizable. They preached the idea of returning to Year Zero, from which humanity might begin anew. They also loathed intellectuals, meaning anyone who so much as wore glasses or owned science books would be condemned to death.